Good evening. And tonight I'll be talking about the fluid interface between symbol and sigil. Now, I've given a number of lectures on this subject over the years, and it had become increasingly apparent to me that there's a kindred relationship between sigils and symbols. And for the most part, I've come to take this bond as being a given. But even so, with this apparency, I realize that it may not be so glaringly obvious. And in fact, every time I think through it again, a number of things turn up that I hadn't thought of before. And so within the light of that, I'm not going to attempt to cover in any extreme thorough fashion the entire field, as it were, between symbol and sigil. It would take hours upon hours. So I'm going to follow this narrow thread this evening, which I believe that may be of benefit. I've certainly found it of quite a bit of interest. And what I'm going to start with is a little bit of background, looking at the etymology and semiotics involved with the term symbol and sigil. And then I'm going to jump straight into a Neoplatonic perspective on this, then discuss sigils in terms of medieval evocation, and then last of all, segue into the realm of Austin Spare's notion of sigils. Now, the term symbol, probably best to start off with an ancillary term, eranos, which means the Greek term, which means a banquet, and something which is contributed to within a social setting. And the reason I mention the term eranos because the Greek term symbolo originated with the idea of with the Athenians when they paid to contribute to the support of the poor or state necessities. So hence, what comes to mind initially is the Eranos lectures that were held in Switzerland by Jung, attended by Corbin, Eliade, Scholem, and others, each speaker's thought being a contribution to the banquet as a whole, which is essentially what we're doing here at this conference. It is a intellectual banquet of sorts that everybody is contributing to. So in this regard, symbols are images, words, signifiers that are of an intellectual sustenance. And that within a Hermetic context, symbols are something that connotes spiritual sustenance as it picks up divine accretions. According to Proclus and Psellus, via certain implications that were connected to a couple of the fragments within the Chaldean oracles, symbola are a means of communicating with the divine by sympathetic modes in the form of statues, plants, animals, etc., working off the premise that the mind of God, the divine nous, is implanted within the souls of created objects. It participates, these plants, images, words, not the other way around. We're not participating the divine nous, but it participates our world. Therefore, whether a consecrated object or any of these forms that I mentioned here are symbolic, they are transmitters of the rays of the things that they actually depict. Proclus, Alkindi, and later on John Dee in his Propidumata Aphoristica mentions the rays of all things are contained within all things. That certain specific symbols or eidolon contain a concentration of these essences through an intentional creative act. So by virtue of the concentration of these rays, symbols are a type of species or eidos, given the Greek perspective, Plato's sophist, for instance, deals with this in detail. And according to Ficino, there's an efflux from the species body, which are called eidolon, hence statues as idols. So from species emanates images. Now, Synesius of Cyrene, in his De Insomniis, his text on dreams, I've been spending a lot of work on it recently. I've had the good fortune of being able to go through the edition of the Hermetica that Ficino had put together towards the end of his life, where it contains his version of De Insomniis, and actually it follows it relatively closely. It's relatively accurate. The edition I've been working through is the one that actually has John Dee's notes in it. So I've been taking the time to try to decipher those because it pertains to current research that I'm doing on the origins of Dee's thought on the ethers. Now, there's a specific passage that jumped out at me when I was thinking about this talk. And in it, Synesius states, from present, past, or future, for the future too is a mode of existence, there flow out images, idola, and these spin away, flake away from their substance. For if every perceptible thing is form combined with matter, and we have found that in the compound matter flows away, then the argument demands that the substance of images also should be channeled off, so that in both cases, being, tonantos, gives up claim to gigomena, that which comes into being. So fairly interesting passage. Here we get the notion of substance being connected with image. And if we when we correlate this with symbols, get the notion that symbols, even though they are generated from substance, they become autonomous, that there is a certain point where there's a scission occurs, where they separate from one another. Synesius also depicts being as spherical. So like a body of a planet in motion, images come off of it, and they vary depending on where the planet is in regard to our vantage points, such as the phases of the moon. These idola are perceivable not primarily through the physical senses, but the spiritual aspects of it through the fantasticon pneuma, or the pneumatic imagination, as he terms it. And this pneumatic imagination acts as a speculum, a mirror, wherein the creative imagination is able to see things reflected, primarily dreams, because Synesius was focusing on them insofar as the dreams are something that are accessible to everyone. And that was probably the main reason why I put it together, although there's a number of other implications to the text. And what comes to mind initially with me with that is that the idea of the okema pneumaticos, or the chariot of the vehicle of the pneuma, the vehicle of the soul. And Synesius would have become aware of this through his reading of Proclus and Iamblichus, most likely, although Synesius was a student of Hypatia's. And so all we know about Hypatia is from her students, and there's a good chance there's an awful lot of her thought infused in what he's written, although it kind of surprises me. A lot of scholars state that the De Insomniis probably has nothing to do with Hypatia's thought, but I have no idea where they're getting that from. I would say the jury's still out on that. But the reason I bring up the notion of the pneumatic vehicle of the soul is, well, for instance, Proclus said that there were probably two vehicles. There's the etheric vehicle of the soul, and as this vehicle descends through the spheres and takes on accretions, when it comes closer to uniting with the corporeal body, that it is shifted aside, and that a pneumatic, a lower vehicle, takes over at that point. Iamblichus felt that that was splitting hairs. He said, no, you have the etheric soul, and as it descends, it picks up accretions. Eventually, it picks up the pneuma, which is more of a a interface between the physical and the etheric realms. So in either case, the reason I mention this is because depending on what school of thought, still the notion of a vehicle of the soul, that symbols are very much, we could call them temporary vehicles of the soul, anything that actually carries the soul to a different level of perception or learning, I think is pertinent and directly connected with that. Now, the pneuma participates the four elements, and air itself as a bridge between corporeal and the incorporeal. Hence, one of the correlations of pneuma is with breath. When we look at the classic etymology of pneuma, one of the first things that comes up typically is the idea of breath. So pneuma feeds the soul, the anima, and this is a Neoplatonic working out of Plato's Phaedrus, the chariot of the soul and its various components and mechanisms. So symbola are dynamic and they animate offspring. As things move, they shed particles. Images have substance which is channeled off, and symbols are some of the things that are spun off from that as food, nutrients, divine traces. Now, symbols are intellectual vehicles of the soul. In a Platonic framework, the intelligible realm is, again, that is approaching the divine nous. And so according to Plato, that's something that we wouldn't initially be able to perceive, but symbols carry traces of that. Now, with that little bit of background, now I'd like to progress to discussing sigils. Now, sigil comes from, the term sigil is the dominion of signum. Signum meaning sign, mark, or token. The diminutive being small figures or images, perhaps like things cut in a signet ring or a seal. Now, within a Neoplatonic or Hermetic framework, the term sigil is something that you're not going to find in, let's say, the Oxford English Dictionary, because it's an actual technical term. I'm actually looking forward to, what is it, the Thesaurus Latina, which is being worked on as we speak in Germany. They started in 1890, and they think they're going to be done by 2050. They've made it to R, so maybe they'll make it to S, and we'll finally get the full lowdown of where they track all of the etymological roots of sigil. Now, sigils are images or signs used for talismanic and or evocational purposes. These signs are constructed so as to attract or activate magical and or angelic forces. They are basically, they're very similar to symbols in that they are tools for communication, but between the mundane, between the corporeal and the spiritual, moving in that direction. Now, magical squares have been used for evocational purposes since the classical period. If we go to Agrippa's De Occulta Philosophia, Book 2, for example, he gives the square of Jupiter. And the square of Jupiter is 4 squares by 4 squares. Hence, the initial significance, the number 4, is emblematic and has been used to depict the planet Jupiter. And within these squares are permutations of the number 4, multiples of it, etc. And then, and I'm not going into, we don't have time to cover the entire formula for it. There's a good article, if you get a chance, you might want to look at it. Carl Anton Nowotny in the Warburg Journal wrote a fairly interesting piece, construction of Cornelius Agrippa's magical squares, and it's rather complicated, and so, which would take hours to discuss, but I just wanted to mention that if anybody here wants to look that up. Now, the basic premises of within the square, you have these numbers, And then through a fairly elaborate system, one draws a line connecting these numbers, forming a sigil, at the same time forming the spirit's names or the intelligence of Jupiter, Elab, and for instance, the spirits, Jophiel and Hismael. Now, there's two things going on here. One, the sigil's being created. The other thing is there is a connection with the Pythagorean formula of God geometrizes. So what was in use was the idea of gematria, of assigning a numerical value to a letter. So when these letters are connected, then one comes up with the name of the deity, given a geometrized semantic base that's endowed with symmetry and proportion. So this whole concept is derived from the classical world's notion of numbers numbered and numbers numbering. Numbers numbered essentially were viewed as those proportions and quantities that God or the divine has projected into the universe, into the physical universe. That these numbers are very similar to divine signature or the signatura rerum, in that they are part and parcel of the numbers numbering, those divine portions, proportions, and numbers that reside within the divine nous of God. Those numbers, man, as I said before, would be considered within the Platonic framework part of the intelligible world that we're not able to perceive. But through the projected numbers numbered into the universe, that's the key segue point. That's where man can hook up into it. So that these numbers, back to Synesius, these numbers numbered could be seen as part of the mathesis in the logic and formation of the substance that he talks about, that is what is spinning off. And that the quantification of this is endowing qualities to matter, so that sigils constructed through proportion and symmetry are combined numbers numbered, and they possess the eidolon or traces of the divine substance instilled with them. So, like a symbol, sigils are a projection of symbols configured in a way so as to serve as a communication device with a magical or spiritual force. Sigils, in this sense, are for projecting outwardly as a medium between the corporeal and incorporeal forces, whereas symbols are projected inwardly, for the most part, and between corporeal beings. So as the saying goes, spirits are evoked, God forms are invoked. Now, in the case of the classical notion of the evocational sigil, its construction follows a very systematic syntax and ontology. It signifies a link with a spirit entity, and it exhibits a defined relationship in terms of formation, number, and purpose. Overall, this type of sigil possesses most, if not all, the attributes of a symbol, language, and signifiers. The difference lies in the use and the purpose. Symbols are constructed physically, whereas sigils, even though they make use of components of physical symbolic construction, for theurgical purposes, they must be formed or traced in chora, the Greek term for space. And through space, the directed astral light or pneuma is used to form these sigils, in essence creating calling cards for spiritual forces. Symbols are the result of divine rays being contained within earthly implements, such as letters, statues, plants, etc., for access on the earth plane, as I mentioned, and that sigils are being directed back toward the incorporeal via the divine rays. Now, in order to transform the soul, this is the main object within the Hermetic, Neoplatonic, theurgical praxis. The term theurgy meaning literally God-making. So that when speaking of sigils and symbols within a classic occult framework, as I just described here, there's little ambiguity insofar as signifiers and their relationship to the topic is concerned. We use words, symbols to discuss or expand upon our understanding of symbols. But with sigils, in terms of Austin Osman Spare's approach, it becomes a little bit more complex and vexed matter. Now, Spare's formula for sigils is initially bound within a definable semantic framework. Spare always, the example that he cited in Book of Pleasure, and that is most often cited, he says, start off with a basic desire, such as, I desire the strength of a tiger. And so rather than going through the sort of complex, systematic approach of the Agrippin type magical square, Spare said basically, you take the sentence, write it out, I desire the strength of a tiger, eliminate, cross out all the vowels, cross out all the repeating consonants, and with the consonants you have left, combine them all into a emblem or seal that bears little or no resemblance to the expressed desire or resembles it in any shape or form, so that there's nothing morphologically connected with it. So Spare diverges from the classical notion of sigils because he suggests that they work best when their purpose is forgotten, okay, lest the result being the barrier to its fruition. So Spare understood this well, and he developed a number of techniques for freeing or dissociating consciousness through the death posture. One of the things he mentioned to do is stand up on one's tiptoes with hands crossed behind the head, doing fire breath, hyperventilating, and getting oneself into sort of a euphoric state. So when one focuses on that sigil, the sigil becomes a bibulant, like a sponge. It sucks up all that energy, it goes into it, and then when one forgets about it, then the subconscious can then go to work on utilizing this energy. In theory, that was the basic setup. Now, hence his dictum, symbols, the conscious mind relates to, sigils, the subconscious. So in that regard, the gray area between the two, the overlap between them, is that sigils and symbols are very close to each other in meaning, but not in purpose. In utilizing sigils for a purpose, the attached meanings demand relinquishing, or in Synesius's term, being, origin, gives up claim to that which comes into being for the sake of efficacy, which I'll add to that. Now, pre-established symbols within Spare's framework can be used as symbols. For instance, the symbol do not, the red circle with the slash through it, do not enter, do not go here, etc. That's a universal symbol. Spare would say, if you're going to use that as a sigil, you want to use it for something that has nothing to do with that basic meaning. So perhaps using it for the antithesis, one would sigilize it, I want to permit creative thoughts to come into my head. So one could use that for that purpose. So intentionally dissociating the symbol from its accepted meaning liberates it from the semantic field. That's the key thing with Spare. So that sigils become intrinsic tools. Unlike the medieval notion of sigils, Spare's notion that they are intrinsically and independently and autonomously developed. Now, symbol, in that respect, is able to become a sigil in the realm of neither. Spare's notion of the neither, neither this, neither that, not one or the other, And as I think about that term, I think Salomo Friedlander, who in the 20s developed this notion of schöpferisch indifference or creative indifference, is very helpful in understanding or grasping that. Friedlander's concept of creative indifference, he had come up with this when he was writing a number of pieces of fiction. The Creator is it's quite a wonderful little novella that Wakefield Press did the translation of. Friedlander posited that there is a gray area that exists between all opposites, life and death, hot and cold, waking and sleeping. This overlapping realm between these contradictory states, he said that is best seen as a realm of creative indifference, where it's indefinable and also something to be harnessed. It is it's on the cusp of fruition, basically, not just conceptually, but imaginatively as well. So there's a very close connection, and I think it helps to shed light on Spare's idea of the neither. Now, as I have thought through this in my own book, Sacred Alignments and Sigils, in chapter 4, I wrote about yantra forming the greater design. I speculated that there may be an intrinsic grammatography at work here. The idea that lines and curves and basic forms, that there might actually be a way to develop or catalog these and their relevance. And Jan Fries's idea of visual magic comes to mind. Fries talks about developing sigils just off the cuff. For instance, looking into the woods and seeing branches falling in a certain formation. Fries says, whatever stands out to you within that image, just sort of isolate it, cut it out, and turn it into a sigil. So obviously there's an aesthetic being implied here. What specifically that aesthetic is another question altogether, and one that I think is worth considering to a certain degree, up to a certain degree. For instance, within the tantrics, the idea of yantra, there's even a lexicon that's been developed there, the idea of point as bindu, ray or line, nada, and continuum or magnitude, paramnaya. So within these, with these forms, with these morphological components, that one develops yantra, and that symbols like yantra are composed of the same elements. Otherwise, symbols could not be known, sigils could not be visualized. And so, Charles Muses, in his Destiny and Controlling Human Systems, sort of takes up the yoke on this. Within his book, he has an interesting chart of phosphenes, those entopically generated images when you close your eyes and rub them a lot and you see patterns and designs. Those are phosphenes. Muses felt that he actually made a little catalog of the basic designs and attributed meanings to them. And as I said, I think it's a point worthy of engaging with it, but as an end overall in itself, the problem is there that, well, on two steps, trying to come up with a universal code may not lead to much, because if we give any credence to what Spare's come up with, that these emblems, these components of sigils that one develops are idiosyncratic. It's up to the individual. So given that approach, trying to come up with a catalog of all the intrinsic meanings, it's almost like coming up with a catalog of 1,000 dreams interpreted. As we know, it just flat out in the end isn't going to pan out because it is an individual process. But I think the value of it lies in that for each and every individual, it might be a project worth working through to some extent, depending on how involved or how useful one finds the system of sigils. It might be something indicative and reflective of certain aspects of not just the personality, but vantage point, perspective. Well, Alberti's whole notion of the ars perspectiva, the art of perspective, but carried to a more of a psychomagical philosophy thereof. Now, as I was considering trying to devise a way of how sigils work in encoding desires, something occurred to me that since if symbols are something the conscious mind can relate to, and sigils the subconscious, then attempting to describe or explicate an operant formula of sigils purely through verbal means is eventually something which seems like it's prone to fall short of the mark. The subconscious does not operate like the conscious mind. That much we can be sure of. All one has to do is look at how dreams operate. Doesn't matter if you meditate or do anything else. If you just pay any attention to how your dreams operate, one can be, if one goes under the assumption that dreams are an indication of what's going on subconsciously, the logic that operates in dreams is something far divorced from the waking state. And when I thought about that, I thought about Heidegger's statement that the only thing more absurd than writing about language is speaking about silence. So granted, in order to discuss the rudiments of sigils in terms of spare system, one has to use a universally recognized verbal means of communication. Spare knew he had to. And so there's just, that's just the plain and simple of it. There's no way around it. However, when you look at what Spare wrote and what most other people write about it, are they actually talking about the specifics, how the mechanisms work within the subconscious? No. Mainly what you're getting is manuals. You're getting formulas for how to make them work, not necessarily any more revealing theorizing on how they actually do work. And so when we get to that point of trying to make more sense out of it and using language, it became clear to me that in a sense, we're begging the question to an extent, or be more specific, Aristotle put it, the petitio principia, begging the principle. So it's not so much the use of language, but it's the logic. It's the logic of how signifiers work is something that in a way is actually running counter to the whole theory of sigils. So we utilize logic and all the impertinences of it in the attempt to describe something that is antithetical to logic itself, the shadow being or the dark recesses of consciousness. So consider Archimedes' dictum. Give me a grain of sand to stand on, and I will move the world. However, Archimedes, he realized himself, that grain of sand to move the world cannot be contained within the world. Okay? Therein lies the rub of that issue. And so the getting at the core mechanism of sigils, language is the catch-22. It's the analog that brings to the fore of the light, but it skirts it ultimately. Spare was cognizant of this, I believe, because when we read his work, you can see he had to develop this entire lexicon, neither, the kia, which meant will, and certain wordplay like AKA, not just meaning alias or also known as, but he would put a and interject a couple of parentheses, so a ka, the idea of the Egyptian ka. So Spare's language was a poesis. It was a made-up language in an attempt to approximate and create a semantics that would go in hand with this newly developed logic. And I think all of us have been, and this isn't just endemic to his work. If we look at any type of magical texts where we encounter the apophatic, aporia such as the God is concealed, but he is present everywhere. And so all mystics, many magicians, many hermeticists find themselves having to lapse into the use of these types of languages. And it's understandable because it's almost like one hand is giving while the other hand is taking away. And so Spare, though, he made the move eventually. Instead of relying on language so much, he would create these drawings, such as Second Death Posture, where he would describe a little bit about it, but then he would fill it in with what he called his sacred alphabet, which is in essence just more sigils. And so he was trying to develop, it's clear, a type of sigil speak, a way to override and at the same override the symbolic and semantic framework and be able to convey the message probably more effectively. So by virtue of talking about sigils, using language, and one engages in the interface between desire and manifestation. It's encoding and coming to fruition. Desire, given one perspective, operates in the background. Language in the foreground, and the ground, depending on one's perspective, is that mysterious, decentered center, that realm of manifestation. And in this interplay between these Gestalt factors, we're being shown something. What that something is open to, and when I wrote this out, I wrote, what that something is open to fill in the blank. And so the mind hastens to interject. What that something is open to interpretation, open to implementation, open to utilization. The conscious mind is always compelled to fill in, but that doesn't necessarily get any closer to aiming, to understanding the actual aim of our inquiry of how to articulate this realm of creative indifference. How do we bring it within a knowable, understandable, and possibly analyzable format? So in the end, it may not be of value to arrive at conclusions in terms with sigils, but perhaps unanswerable questions, notions for contemplation or not. And so as I thought about this more, if sigils only work when they are aligned with our will, then the will to manifest is dependent upon where one is at, not just in terms of internal, but where one is at in terms of one's awareness or positioning or alignment with the anima mundi, or soul of the world. And I'm not suggesting a fatalism, but I'm wondering how much, for instance, if sigils are aligned with one's will, and when one utilizes a sigil and one finds that it manifests, is this a case of so much a contrivance or a manufacturing of a sigil, or is it an alignment? Is it an alignment with a will or with a current? And so I come back to Synesius, as he suggested, symbols, they are images that spin away from their substances. Sigils are images, dissociated and indefinable, that spin into the realm of manifestation, into the realm of substance and composition. So to come to a conclusion, in a sense, is to abrogate the neither, or this creative indifference, this fluid realm between the two. And I think, and I realized the more when I was composing this and writing it out, that I found myself tripping up on myself constantly. It's like, well, wait, I'm losing track of the main topic here. I'm being led to a new one. And then I realized that it's probably, considering the actual logic that I'm talking about here, that I should be pleased with my lack of control and understanding. And I actually relish my unknowing. And I think as we come to terms with understanding this field of interaction between symbols and sigils, that realm of unknowing, that to have a presence of mind, not so much of just what we don't know, but the intimate, the exact aspects of what we don't know and how we don't know it. This presence of mind for the aporia will in turn build upon itself and perhaps indicate much more than should we thought we could come to some sort of academic conclusion about it. And so symbols and sigils and the connection with them, I think much like I was taught by a fairly astute language specialist, Walter Strauss in Cleveland. He said poetry isn't something that, and I believe magic is much the same way, magical and mystical texts aren't things that we sit there and can analyze. They bear much more fruit if we learn how to be with them, to be with and to allow these things to permeate and overwhelm the senses. And so I came up with an idea of sigilisms. I was going to call them spin-offs, but sigilisms sounds quite a bit like syllogism, which is on purpose, for lack of better words, and I do mean that lack of better words sincerely. So I've thrown a few sigilisms together just to sort of leave as parting notions rather than to draw any sort of closure on this talk, because to do so would just be dismantling what I've attempted to do so far. So here's a few I'll just toss your way. If sigils' efficacy are dependent upon alignment with the will and true desire, which are components in time, then sigils are characters of time spelling out manifestations. Desire and time are bound in a unity. In time, desire changes. With time, it is possible to learn about eternal desire. Sigils in speech, fleeting feathers of a wing, lift and land. Sigils descend from substance only to engage mutation. Subconscious projections happen much more than ever realized. Meaning is made in control. Materialization is not. Take it or leave it to work. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.